For 7 years, Sia was the invisible ghost behind the Dragon Syndicate. She didn't just manage the books, she built the throne Jun Young sat on, turning a street gang into a multi-billion won empire. But at the summit, Jun Young decided his loyal wife was a liability. He didn't just divorce her, he erased her, seizing the high-rise, the sedans, and every account she'd protected. Standing on a rain-slicked curb in Gangnam with one crumpled banknote, Sia was told to go beg for scraps. But Jun Young had left one door unlocked. Please share comments and subscribe. Hit the like button before we continue with the story. Sia spent her last cent on a forgotten warehouse, a concrete tomb in the mud. Inside, the air tasted of wet concrete and buried secrets. She hadn't come for a miracle, but for the only roof Jun Young's lawyers deemed too worthless to steal. Beneath a rotted tarp, she unearthed a waterproof safe bolted to the foundation 7 years ago. Inside were the black ledgers, every drop of blood Jun Young spilled. Tucked at the back sat a 1990 land deed signed in blood by his father. It was a dowry for Sia, predating the marriage. She wasn't a victim anymore. She was the landlord of the underworld. The glass walls of the penthouse office offered a panoramic view of Seoul's neon skyline, but inside, the air was as frigid as a morgue. Jun Young stood behind his massive obsidian desk, the city lights reflecting off his perfectly tailored charcoal suit. He didn't look like a man who had just dismantled a woman's life. He looked like a man who had just finished a tedious chore. Sia stood across from him, her fingers digging into the leather of her cheap handbag. Her hair, once sleek and professional, was slightly unkempt from 48 hours of frantic damage control. The last 48 hours she would ever spend protecting his name. "You're staring, Sia," Jun Young said, his voice smooth and devoid of the warmth that had fooled her for 7 years. He picked up a crystal tumbler of whiskey, the ice clinking with a rhythmic, mocking sound. "It's unbecoming. We both knew this day would come. The Dragon Syndicate is no longer a street-level operation. We are corporate. We are legitimate. And you?" He tilted his head, eyes scanning her weathered face with a clinical coldness. "I built that legitimacy," Sia whispered, her voice cracking. "I laundered the reputation of every man in this room. I stayed awake for 7 years so you could sleep without looking over your shoulder." Jun Young let out a sharp, jagged laugh that echoed off the glass. It was the sound of a predator who had finally grown bored of his prey. "And you were paid for your services, weren't you? But let's be honest, you were never an equal. You were a tool, a very efficient one. But tools wear out." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a single 50,000 won banknote. He didn't hand it to her. He didn't even look at her as he flicked his wrist, letting the orange slip of paper flutter through the air. It landed in the plush carpet at her feet, a tiny, insulting splash of color against the gray. "Go beg your wife," he mocked, using the stinging slang for a man, or in this case, a woman, reduced to nothing. "Or go beg the streets. I don't care. But the high-rise, the accounts, and the security, they stay with the syndicate. You have 10 minutes to exit the building before my men treat you like the intruder you've become." Sia looked down at the bill. It was a single note for 7 years of blood. The betrayal wasn't just in the money, it was in the laughter that followed her as she turned toward the door. As she walked out, the grayscale coldness began to seep into her bones, replacing the grief. Jun Young thought he had discarded a broken woman, but as the elevator doors hissed shut, Sia didn't cry. She simply remembered exactly where the foundation of his tower was cracked. The rain in the outskirts of Seoul didn't fall, it was punished. It turned the industrial district into a blurred landscape of rust and charcoal, a stark contrast to the climate-controlled perfection of the penthouse Sia had been exiled from only hours before. She stood on the cracked pavement of a dead-end street, her thin coat soaked through, her breath hitching in the biting wind. A Across the city, she knew Jun Young was likely raising a glass of 30-year-old scotch to his clean future, toasting the fact that he had finally cut away the last piece of his dirty past. He was celebrating a new beginning built on her bones. In front of her stood the warehouse, a jagged silhouette of corrugated metal and broken glass that looked more like a shipwreck than a piece of real estate. The for sale sign was so faded it was barely legible, hanging by a single rusted nail. A man emerged from a parked, dented sedan, shielding himself with a tattered umbrella. He was a low-level broker who specialized in the kind of properties people bought when they were either desperate or hiding. He looked at Sia's trembling frame and then at the skeletal building behind her. "You're sure about this, lady?" he asked, his voice barely audible over the drum of the rain. "The plumbing is shot, the roof is a suggestion at best, and the city is 10 years from caring about this block. It's a tomb." Sia didn't blink. She reached into her bag and pulled out an envelope. It contained the check from her liquidated personal savings and the single crumpled 50,000 won note Jun Young had tossed at her feet. The ultimate insult, now repurposed as her final stake. It was every cent she had left in the world. If this building didn't hold what she hoped it did, she wouldn't just be poor, she would be finished. "I'm not looking for a home," Sia said, her voice raspy but steady. She handed him the envelope. Her fingers brushed against his, ice cold and pale. "I'm looking for the ground." The broker counted the bills, shrugged, and handed her a heavy, rusted ring of keys. "It's yours. Good luck. You'll need it." He didn't stay to watch her open the door. As his taillights vanished into the downpour, Sia turned to the massive steel entrance. She was a woman who had once moved millions with a keystroke, now struggling to turn a physical lock in the dark. When the bolt finally gave way with a piercing metallic scream, she stepped inside. The air was thick with the scent of stagnant water and oil, a heavy silence that felt like a physical weight. She was alone, penniless, and shivering, but as she closed the door against the world that had discarded her, the grief in her chest finally hardened into a cold, lethal resolve. She wasn't begging anymore. She was digging. The beam of Sia's flashlight cut through the heavy, suffocating darkness of the basement like a scalpel. Here, beneath the skeletal frame of the warehouse, the air was thick with the scent of damp earth and oxidized metal. Every step she took echoed against the low concrete ceiling, a hollow sound that seemed to mock her desperation. She wasn't just looking for storage, she was looking for the ghost of a man who had predicted Jun Young's treachery long before she had even met him. Her father-in-law had been a man of shadows, a pioneer of the syndicate who understood that power was a fleeting vapor, but leverage was eternal. Sia reached the far corner of the foundation, where the concrete felt unusually cold, even for a flooded cellar. She ran her fingers over the surface, feeling for the hairline fracture she remembered from a feverish conversation years ago. When she found it, she didn't hesitate. She swung the heavy sledgehammer she dragged from the upstairs floor, the impact vibrating through her teeth and up her spine. Crack! The sound was deafening in the enclosed space. She swung again, fueled by the image of Jun Young's mocking laughter and the orange banknote fluttering to the floor. On the fifth strike, the false facade groaned and buckled, revealing a cavity lined with lead. Behind the wall sat a heavy, industrial-grade safe, its dial encrusted with a fine layer of white salt. Sia's breath hitched, the freezing air burning her lungs. Her fingers, raw and bruised, trembled as she dialed the sequence, a date Jun Young had long forgotten, but one his father had cherished. The heavy iron bolts retracted with a slow, metallic shriek. When the door swung open, it didn't reveal stacks of gold or bundles of untraceable cash. Instead, it held rows of leather-bound volumes and a series of encrypted hard drives, all meticulously vacuum-sealed in plastic. She pulled the first ledger out, her hands shaking as she broke the seal. As she flipped through the pages, the grayscale coldness in her eyes deepened into something lethal. These were the black ledgers, the unfiltered, unwashed history of the Dragon Syndicate. Every bribe, every body, and every betrayal Jun-Young thought he had scrubbed clean to enter his new corporate world was written here in his father's jagged, unmistakable hand. But tucked into the very back of the safe was a separate translucent folder. Inside sat the 1990 land deed, the paper yellowed, but the crimson fingerprint of the original witness still vivid. Sia let out a jagged, broken laugh that transformed into a silent, terrifying smile. Jun-Young told her to beg for scraps, unaware that he was currently standing on her property, breathing air she now controlled. She tucked the ledgers against her chest. The cold metal of the safe no longer felt like a tomb. It felt like a throne. The loyal ghost was officially gone. The landlord of the underworld had arrived. The rain had finally tapered off into a miserable, clinging fog by the time Jiha arrived at the warehouse. A top-tier defense attorney who had built her career on finding the microscopic cracks in bulletproof contracts, Jiha was not easily impressed. She stepped over a puddle of stagnant water, her sharp blue suit a jarring contrast to the rusted industrial decay surrounding them. She looked at the yellowed documents spread out on a makeshift table, an old wooden crate, and then at Sia, whose face was now a mask of granite and shadow. Jiha adjusted her glasses, her eyes scanning the faded ink of the 1990 deed with a clinical intensity that slowly melted into a look of genuine shock. She ran a gloved finger over the crimson fingerprint at the bottom, the mark of Jun-Young's father. For a long moment, the only sound in the warehouse was the rhythmic drip of a leak from the ceiling hitting a bucket. He was smarter than anyone gave him credit for, Jiha whispered, her voice tight with professional admiration. She looked up at Sia, a sharp glint in her eyes. Jun-Young's legal team spent 18 months cleansing his assets before the divorce. They moved the casino, the holding firms, and the penthouse into offshore trusts. They thought they were being thorough by stripping you of every corporate title you held. But they made one fatal assumption.
Gia tapped the deed. They assumed the land underneath the Dragon Casino was part of the syndicate's collective inheritance. It's not. Your father-in-law didn't deed this to his son or to the organization. He deeded the physical soil, the exact GPS coordinates of the syndicate's headquarters, to you, personally, as a dowry 7 years before he died. In the eyes of Korean property law, this is separate, non-marital property. It was never his to take, and it was never yours to lose in a divorce. Sia felt a cold shiver of triumph race down her spine. The weight of the last 7 years, the sleepless nights, the unthanked labor, the crushing betrayal in the penthouse, suddenly felt lighter. So the building belongs to the syndicate, Sia clarified, her voice like cracking ice. But the earth it's built on belongs to me. Exactly, Gia replied, a predatory smile tugging at the corner of her mouth. The building is a fixture, but without a valid ground lease, it's effectively an illegal structure. Jun-Young isn't a king, he's a squatter. He spent millions renovating a tower that sits on a foundation he has zero right to occupy. We don't just have a case, Sia. We have a kill switch. Whenever you're ready, we can serve him an eviction notice for his own throne. Sia looked at her hands, no longer trembling. She wasn't the woman clutching a single banknote on a rain-slicked curb anymore. She was the one holding the leash. Not yet, Sia murmured, her gaze turning toward the neon glow of the city in the distance. I want him to spend a little more money on my property first. I want him to feel safe before I take the ground from under his feet. The silence of the warehouse was broken not by the rain, but by the heavy, rhythmic thrum of a luxury engine idling outside. Sia didn't need to look through the grime-streaked windows to know who was there. She sat in the shadows of the mezzanine, the black ledgers resting on her lap like a loaded weapon, as the heavy steel door creaked open. Min-jae stepped inside, his polished Italian leather shoes clicking sharply against the damp concrete. As Junyoung's most trusted enforcer and the man who had personally escorted Sia to the curb only days ago, he looked entirely out of place amidst the rust. He didn't come with the usual squad of thugs. He came alone, his face a carefully constructed mask of professional indifference that didn't quite reach his restless eyes. "Sia," he called out, his voice echoing into the rafters. "I know you're in here. Let's not make this more dramatic than it needs to be." Sia remained still until he reached the center of the floor, right where the light from a single flickering bulb hit the dust. "You're a long way from the penthouse, Min-jae," she said, her voice dropping from the shadows like a guillotine. "Did Junyoung run out of people to mock?" Min-jae stopped, his gaze snapping upward. He didn't smile. Instead, he reached into his breast pocket and pulled out a thick, cream-colored envelope. The boss realized the emotional toll of the divorce might have clouded his judgment. He's offering you a way out. This warehouse? It's a hazard, a liability. He's willing to buy it back for triple what you paid. Cash. Tonight. Sia descended the iron stairs slowly, her movements fluid and devoid of the weathered exhaustion he expected. She saw the way his eyes flickered toward the basement door, the frantic, subtle search for something he feared she had already found. "Triple," Sia mused, stopping just out of his reach. Junyoung doesn't pay triple for anything unless the floor is falling out from under him. He's panicking, isn't he? He realized the deed wasn't in the central archive. He realized the loyal ghost knew exactly which stone held up his tower. Min-jae's mask slipped. A vein pulsed in his temple, and his hand tightened on the envelope. "It's a generous offer, Sia. Take the money and leave Seoul. If you refuse, this building becomes your corpse. You know how he handles leaks." "He already tried to bury me," Sia said, stepping into the light. Her eyes were no longer filled with the grief of a discarded wife. They were cold, calculated, and terrifyingly bright. "Tell Junyoung that if he wants his land back, he'll have to do better than cash. Tell him the landlord is keeping the building, and tell him to start packing. The rent is about to become more than he can afford to pay." Min-jae backed away, the snake finally realizing he was in a room with a predator much larger than himself. He left the envelope on a rusted oil drum, but as his car roared away, Sia didn't even look at the money. She knew the panic had set in. The king was losing his ground, and the harvest had only just begun. The transformation didn't happen with a roar, but in the absolute, terrifying silence of a bathroom mirror illuminated by a single flickering bulb. Sia looked at the woman staring back, the hollowed eyes, the hair that smelled of rain and betrayal, the face of a victim. With a pair of rusted industrial shears, she hacked through the long, dark strands that Junyoung had once called his favorite accessory. They fell to the damp floor like dead weight. When she was finished, her hair was a sharp, jagged bob that framed a face no longer capable of flinching. She reached into a small trunk she had salvaged and pulled out a silk blouse the color of dried blood. It was the only item of her former life she had kept, a crimson flag of war. She stepped out of the warehouse and into the cold Seoul night, her presence now carrying a grayscale intensity that seemed to drain the color from the neon signs around her. She wasn't hiding anymore. She was descending. Minho was waiting in the back of a dimly lit tea house in Myeongdong, a place where the walls were thick enough to swallow secrets. As the disgraced younger brother of a rival clan, he was a man who lived on the periphery of the underworld, surviving on scraps of intelligence and a burning desire for parody. He didn't rise when she approached. He simply watched her with a wary, predatory curiosity. "You look different, Sia," Minho remarked, his voice a low gravel. "The last time I saw you, you were the Syndicate's ghost. Now you look like you're haunting yourself." "I'm not a ghost," Sia replied, sliding into the booth. The crimson of her blouse caught the low light, looking like a fresh wound. I'm the debt Junyang forgot to pay, and I know you've been trying to find the crack in his corporate shell for 3 years. You're failing because you're looking at his money. I'm looking at his foundation. She placed a single digital drive on the table, the key to the black ledgers. Minho's eyes widened as he realized the sheer volume of data she was offering. It was the syndicate's nervous system, laid bare. I have the land deeds, I have the ledgers, and I have the legal leverage to evict him from his own headquarters, she said, her voice like the snap of a winter branch. But I need your infrastructure to move the assets once he falls. I want his empire dismantled piece by piece from the inside out until there is nothing left for him to beg for. Minho leaned forward, the air between them thick with the scent of bitter tea and impending ruin. He saw the cold, calculated fire in her eyes and realized that the woman Junyang had discarded was no longer a person. She was an event. He reached out and covered the drive with his hand, a silent oath. The partnership was sealed. The grayscale queen had found her general, and for Junyang, the sun was beginning to set on a kingdom he didn't even realize he had already lost. The boardroom of the Dragon Syndicate was a cathedral of glass and arrogance, smelling of expensive cologne and the metallic tang of unspoken threats. Junyang sat at the head of the mahogany table, basking in the sycophantic nods of his directors as they finalized the public offering that would make him untouchable. He was laughing, a sound of pure, unadulterated triumph, when the heavy oak doors didn't just open, they were held wide by 2 massive men in slate-gray suits who moved with the synchronized precision of a firing squad. The laughter died in Junyang's throat when Sia stepped into the room. The directors gasped, but Junyang only narrowed his eyes, his fingers tightening around a gold fountain pen. She didn't look like the woman he had discarded on the curb. Dressed in her crimson blouse, her hair a sharp, lethal blade against her jaw, she carried an aura of grayscale coldness that seemed to dim the very lights of the room. Behind her stood Jia, clutching a briefcase like a weapon. "Sia?" Junyang said, his voice a low, dangerous warning. "I told you what happens to intruders. You're overstepping." "I'm not an intruder, Junyang," her voice replied, calm and terrifyingly resonant. She walked to the head of the table, ignoring the security detail that hesitated, paralyzed by the sheer authority of her movement. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't have to. "I'm the owner, and you're overstaying." She didn't wait for his response. With a fluid, dismissive motion, she slid a thick stack of legal documents across the mahogany surface. It skated over the polished wood, coming to a dead stop against Junyang's chest. "What is this?" he hissed, though his face was already beginning to pale. "It's an eviction notice," Jia announced, her voice cutting through the stunned silence. "Effective immediately. This building and the 3 city blocks surrounding it sit on land deeded to the Min family bloodline in 1990. As the sole heir and legal title holder, my client is terminating your occupancy. You have 30 minutes to clear your personal effects before my security team seals the elevators." Junyang ripped the top page, his eyes darting across the legalese. The color drained from his lips as he saw the red fingerprint of his father, the one piece of his history he couldn't buy or bury. The board members began to whisper, a frantic, rising tide of panic, as they realized the foundation of their multi-billion won deal was literally being pulled from beneath them. Sia leaned down, her face inches from his. The smell of the warehouse, wet concrete and buried secrets, seemed to follow her, suffocating him. "You told me to go beg, Junyang," she whispered, the ghost of a smile touching her lips. "But it turns out you're the one sitting in my chair. Get out of my house." She turned on her heel and walked out, the heavy doors thudding shut behind her, leaving the king of the underworld staring at a pile of paper that had just turned his empire into a crime scene. The sound of the first sledgehammer hitting the reinforced glass of the lobby was a heartbeat louder than the sirens wailing outside. In a choreographed explosion of black tactical gear and flashing blue lights, the legitimate world Junyang had fought to join finally came for him. The federal investigators didn't move like street thugs he was used to. They moved like accountants with the power of God, armed with the black ledgers Sia had quietly fed into the system.
Inside the executive wing, the air was thick with the smell of ozone and burnt paper. Junyang stood in the center of his ransacked office, watching his agents and windbreakers crated up 7 years of his life. He reached for his phone, his fingers trembling as he dialed his mistress, Sia. The line was dead. He dialed Min-jae, his shadow, the man who knew where the bodies were buried. Nothing. The realization hit him with a physical force. A mafia boss is only a king as long as he has a kingdom to protect his people. Without the land, without the immunity, he was just a man in an expensive suit standing in a crime scene. His allies, the politicians he'd bribed and the CEOs he'd coerced, vanished like mist under a heat lamp. By noon, the Dragon Syndicate's stock had plummeted into the dirt, and by 2, the board of directors had issued a formal statement disavowing his existence. He was radioactive. He slumped into the corner of the room, the only place the agents hadn't yet touched. The heavy, gold-plated fountain pen he had used to sign the erasure of Sia sat on the floor, leaking ink onto the white marble like a slow, bleeding wound. He reached out, his hand brushing against a stray piece of paper that had been left behind in the chaos. It wasn't a ledger or a bank statement. It was the original eviction notice Sia had skated across the table, the paper he had mocked, the paper he had tried to rip to shreds. The gray-scale coldness of the room felt absolute. He looked out the window, expecting to see his fleet of black sedans, but saw only tow trucks and police barriers. He was alone. The power he thought was his birthright had been nothing more than a lease, and the landlord had finally come to collect. As the lead investigator stepped toward him with a pair of silver handcuffs, Junyang clutched the crumpled eviction notice to his chest. It was the only thing he had left. A bitter paper reminder that, while he had been playing at being a god, Sia had simply been owning the earth. He looked at the signature of his father one last time and realized the betrayal wasn't hers, it was his own. He had traded a queen for a temporary throne, and now the throne was gone. The rain had returned to the outskirts of Seoul, but it no longer felt like a punishment. To Sia, it felt like a baptism. She stood on the iron balcony of the warehouse, the rusted metal steady beneath her boots. Clad in her crimson silk, she looked out over the industrial wasteland she now called her kingdom. Below, the sleek black sedans and neon lights of her former life were nowhere to be seen. There was only the gray sludge of the shipyard and the sound of a man braking. Junyang was no longer the king of Seoul. He was a shadow, drenched and shivering in the rising mud of the warehouse yard. His $5,000 suit was ruined, plastered to his frame like a second pathetic skin. He was on his knees, his hands clawing at the gravel as he looked up at the balcony, his face a distorted mask of desperation. The federal agents had taken his assets, his allies had taken his pride, and the streets had taken his dignity. "Sia," he screamed, his voice cracking against the wind. "Please, you're the only one left. You're the only one who knows how the accounts were routed. Just one name, Sia. Give me one contact, one lifeline, and I'll give you anything. I'll give you back the name. I'll make you the head of the firm." Sia leaned against the railing, her gray-scale eyes watching him with a clinical, detached curiosity. She didn't feel the surge of rage she had expected. She didn't feel the need to scream or mock him. All she felt was a profound, icy silence. She looked at the man who told her to beg, and she saw nothing but a tool that had finally outlived its usefulness. "You're still bartering with things you don't own, Junyang," she said, her voice carrying easily through the rain, cold and resonant. "The firm is gone. The name is mine, and the only thing you have left to give is an apology I stopped needing 7 years ago."
I was wrong, he wailed, his forehead hitting the wet earth. I thought I was the hope, but it was you. You were the foundation. Sia, don't leave me out here. I have nothing. You have exactly what you gave me, Sia replied. She adjusted her sleeves, the deep red fabric vivid against the gray sky. You have the ground. You should be grateful, at least I'm letting you stay on it for free tonight. She didn't wait to hear his final plea. As Zhenyang sobbed into the mud, a broken relic of a dead empire, Sia turned her back on the view. She stepped inside the warehouse, the heavy steel door groaning on its hinges, and with a final, decisive click, the lock engaged, swallowing the sound of his begging. In the sudden, warm silence of her own house, Sia finally stopped being a ghost. She walked toward the light, leaving the man who thought she was nothing to face the darkness alone. Moral lessons. The narrative of Go Beg Your Wife serves as a powerful reminder that power without a foundation of character is merely a temporary lease. The fallacy of disposability. Zhenyang's greatest mistake was viewing people as tools rather than partners. By discarding Sia, he didn't just lose his wife, he dismantled his own defense system. The lesson is clear. Your success is only as strong as the loyalty of those who helped you build it. When you treat people as disposable, you eventually become disposable yourself. The weight of invisible labor. Sia represents the ghost in the machine, the silent worker whose contributions are often overlooked until they're gone. Her victory highlights that true value isn't found in a title or a tailored suit, but in the competence and knowledge one carries. Zhenyang had the throne, but Sia had the blueprints. The law of the harvest. Ultimately, the story illustrates that you cannot build a clean future on a dirty foundation. Zhenyang's past crimes and his mistreatment of Sia were the seeds of his own ruin. In the end, he was left with the very ground he mocked, proving that integrity is the only currency that never devalues. Thanks for watching. Tell the moral lesson you learn in the comments section. Like, share, and subscribe for more updates from us. See you next time.